Take a little bit. Hello, this is Julian Chambliss here for Rethinking the City. Talking to Max Grinnell, who also goes by, of course, the magnificent moniker, the urbanologist. Urbanologist. Of course, I got it wrong. Urbanologist. Max is actually the author of a forthcoming book called Secret Chicago through John Lake Publishing. It's a culture and travel publishing imprint. Max has spoken with Rethinking the City before, but I want to ask him a question that I think is really important to our theme this month. Of course, this month we're looking at sport in the city. Max, of course, has been writing about urbanization in places like Boston and Chicago for many years. And so I wanted to ask Max a question, and that question is, Max, why is sport so important to the city?
Great question. Thank you for having me, Julian. I think, in the modern world, whether we're in, Lagos, whether we're in Jacksonville, whether we're in Boston, it's such kind of a shorthand for people to identify with the aspirations, the rise and fall of your city. I get on a plane, people will frequently ask me, or other people will talk about who you're rooting for in the big game, etc. And it's kind of an easy way to kind of, as a port of entry for thinking about different cities, is, no one sits down and says, well, tell me about your tax increment finance districts, or, tell me about please let's have an informal conversation about racial segregation, like, weighty, meaty topics. It's kind of that entry point. And, I always think of the things that made this possible: newspapers, multiple newspapers in big American cities, radio, television, and of course the capital I internet, which makes this such a kind of an easy way to kind of get people thinking about American cities and all over the world, really.
I think you make a great point there, especially when you talk about the importance of an easy entry point for urbanism, not just domestically, internationally. I noticed over the years, of course, with the growth of international sports like American football, uh, soccer here, but football everywhere else is a perfect example of that. It's complicated. Of course, Americans have their own set of sports that we tend to look at as like our collective pastimes. In particular, the holy trinity of sport. I think it generally accepted to be football, basketball, and baseball in no particular order. I'm sure if you're in the Northeast, it would be baseball perhaps first for some people, or basketball. I think in the South we might make the argument that football is the most important thing, um, but perhaps not. That is one of the things that makes it really interesting. Because you've written so much about a place like Chicago. Chicago, of course, has an amazing sports history, and I remember I mentioned to you that I wanted to, like, if you could come up with a good Chicago sports story, that would be ideal for this little segment. So can you tell me a great Chicago sports story?
Well, I do have a couple great Chicago sports stories. I think one of them is kind of in terms of the history of the city of Chicago, is the success of the various Negro League teams. And I was reading a recent book from Arcadia Press about this, and also going to some celebrations at Chicago Public Library for African American History Month, and talking about how there were those two cities then and now, of course, that kind of developed these parallel set of pastimes. And to me, the success of teams like the Chicago American Giants are such an important part of this story. As a long-suffering Cubs fan, I am, on the other side of things, and on the other side of the professional baseball thing, it's been interesting to see how the Cubs have been, especially in the recent years with the new ownership, how they are kind of negotiating the renovation of Wrigley Field, and kind of their place in the north side of Chicago. So, I like how sports also intersect with public policy, which fascinates me. And I will say this, despite having lived in Chicago most of my adult life, I will never be a Bears fan. That's my final word on that.
I think you make a great point about another issue that I think does intersect with sport, but we don't necessarily always think about it, and that has to do, of course, with questions of identity and community. The sort of academic way of talking about that. One of the things, of course, that made baseball, I think, so important to the American experience is that so many immigrant communities in the 19th century played baseball, right? It's one of the things that defined immigrant spaces. You had competitive teams in neighborhoods that were working and sort of playing against each other. This both bolstered the internal community, but also bolstered sort of competition, friendly competition, as opposed to some of the harsher kind of competition you might associate with urban experiences in the 19th century. So ethnicity actually has a lot to do with sport and the city. And you rightly point to some of the segregation associated with a game like baseball. But of course, baseball is one of the first sort of sports in American sports to desegregate. What would you say would be a policy issue, sort of like spinning off of that? You know, we have these questions about identity and community in an American city now, how money is spent. Increasingly, when we talk about the pursuit of major sports teams, often those pursuits take place in communities in terms of like, well, what do we need to do? Well, we need to build a stadium and so on and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about some of those stories about the movement
absolutely.
of teams, stadiums, and stuff like that?
Yeah, and I'm thinking of my own Boston, Chicago experience in the late '80s, early '90s. Comiskey Park, which where the White Sox played since 1910, which was increasingly surrounded by poverty. There was talk of, before the existence of the Tampa Bay Rays, they basically threatened the owner, Jerry Reinsdorf, who owns the Chicago Bulls, said, of course, we're going to Florida. So the thought of you losing, here's this, the team's been there for a century plus. They came up with and I'm going to get the name wrong, but like the Illinois Sports Authority to basically issue the bonds so the White Sox would remain in a new park, which has changed names. It's now the U.S. Cellular Field. And I also think about your identity and community question. One thing for the city of Chicago that kind of swept away some of the rat-a-tat Tommy gun history of the 1920s was the rise of Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. People would say they'd go to everywhere from India to Nigeria and to say Chicago, and people would say Michael Jordan, as opposed to Al Capone, which it's harder to market and brand your city around a 1920s gangster. Whereas here's this life-affirming, all-around good guy, athlete, and part of a world championship series. So I'm reminded of two things in your question.
Well, and it's also, I think, really interesting that you bring up Jordan, because Jordan was an international icon around basketball. Part of, I think, the NBA's global push was connected to Michael Jordan and his success. But that does bring me back to this sort of transformation in American sport, because we are seeing the rise of soccer in the U.S., but football everywhere else, as a major new sport venue that's connected, that is at some level connecting people all over the world. Now we have American fans of football in Europe and the UK. They're avid followers of that kind of those leagues and those stars, and now we have the Major League Soccer enterprise in places like Orlando and places like Chicago. What is that doing to the sports landscape from your perspective, looking at a place like Chicago, looking at a place like Boston, which you also spent a lot of time in?
I think it's exciting because, in a positive, life-affirming way, in debates about how our country is changing, it's acknowledging the rich cultural diversity of people we are so fortunate to have here. And also just not, it's not just people from countries where they're strongholds, like Latin America, South and Southeast Asia, but it's older people kind of getting on board. I think of the old soccer moms phenomenon, or whatever you want to call it, but I think it's part of a groundswell that says, here's this kind of sport which has been here, but it's also like, boy, this is exciting. How do we celebrate it? And how do we come together around it? I think it's great. And I also think of soccer becoming so popular in the U.S. Look at the barrier to entry. I mean, really, and I don't play soccer. I'm horrible at soccer, but you need a couple goals and a ball.
Right.
Stuff you need for baseball and football and basketball. It's you need a lot of stuff. I mean, that's the long and the short of it. And what sport's next to catch fire in the U.S.? I'd be really curious. Would it be like a cricket? Would it be high lie? And I mean, this kind of goes beyond our conversation, but the rise of, and I think it's a little bit troubling, but the rise of like kind of popular ultraviolet competition like MMA and UFC, and which aren't really, are they sports? Yes, but anyways, I'm getting a little bit off track, but just thinking about your question.
Well, actually, I think you make a good point about the barriers to entry. I think that same language was used for years to describe, basketball and why minority students or minority people were excelling in basketball. Well, that was the infrastructure that was available to them where they lived, right? So you could go to the playground, find a basketball hoop as a young child, and get adept at that. Now that same sort of like rhetoric with a lower bar, arguably, all you really need is a ball. You don't even need a hoop. Does speak to the popularity that is possible with something like soccer in the U.S. So I think you make a great point, but I hope that for those of you who are listening out there for Rethinking the City Radio, that this gave you a chance to sort of think about sport in a different light. Matt's new book, Secret Chicago, is going to weave together questions and answers around all the things that sort of like represent the fabric of urban life and sport and culture and food and special places. So look for that coming out. Also, of course, look for our monthly meeting on Rethinking the City Symposium, where we'll be talking about sport in Orlando and the structures that are affecting the transformation of our city. But thanks for listening, and thanks, Max, for checking in and offering some of his insights and stories that he's accumulated over the years through his research. Thanks a lot, Max.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks for listening to this sort of like supplement to Rethinking the City Radio. Thanks to the hosts, Pat and Sarah. And I will talk to you guys later, hopefully. Bye-bye.